Hello, my name is Paul Roddick. I'm from Reds 10. We are an off-site modular contractor, and today we're going to talk to you about our NetCAP program for the British Army and the DIO.
Hi, yeah, my name's Tom Hook. Also working at Reds 10 with Paul. I've been working with Paul very closely for the last 2.5 years in delivering the NetCAP scheme. Looking forward to telling you all about the buildings.
So today we're going to talk about the NetCAP program, which was a program that we started working on 4 years ago for the British Army. And basically, the program was to replace the training estate, is where our British soldiers do all their training in far-flung corners of the British Isles, and we were replacing their accommodation on their estate. And their accommodation is basically where they do their training. So it's called transit accommodation, and they'll be in these accommodation blocks for anywhere for a week to 4 weeks on training exercises. The British Army were really keen to do something different, so they were keen that these units were DREAM excellent. The ability for the buildings to be split into two. They also wanted to explore off-site construction. They are a really busy estate, as you can imagine. There's live fire going on and tanks rolling around, so they want to build as much in the factory as possible, and that's why they approached Reds 10 to work with them across the programme. So we did the programme in 3 phases, but the upshot is in over the space of 3 years, we replaced 25% of the accommodation on the estate, which amounts to between 4,000 and 5,000 bed spaces. And from having an estate with no net zero carbon buildings, the Army now has kind of the most on the estate of any government department. This picture is quite interesting because if you look at the background of the picture on the right, you'll see those kind of small Nissan huts in the background. And they were put there over 90 years ago, and that's where our British troops have been staying when they go on exercise. And the buildings in the front, which you see with the PVs on the roof, which are the new NetCAP buildings, is what's replaced them. So literally between 80 and 90 years, they put new accommodation on the estate, and they really pushed the bar. But what's quite interesting about this this program is that although we've built almost 100 buildings now, no 2 buildings are the same. We've taken so much learning from them because they were the first net zero program buildings that we've ever built. And from that, we've understood how we can progress in terms of reducing the embodied carbon, reducing the operational carbon, and also increasing the speed in which we build them on site, which we'll talk about on this presentation now. The first thing, so for the very first prototype, we built the building, and there wasn't really any targets in terms of embodied carbon. And the first prototype building was built at West Down Camp, which is down in Salisbury Plain. And as you can see there with the orange line, it had almost 400 tons of embodied carbon within the construction, and that includes the actual construction on site, in the factory, and also the materials. And we were set a challenge as to how we can reduce the embodied carbon in the building. And we did manage that because actually we looked at the build process and we changed a number of the materials and we also increased the speed of construction. So we reduced the construction time in the factory from 14 weeks to 9 weeks. And we also reduced the on-site construction time on site from up to 15 weeks down to 8 weeks as well. So the total program of these buildings getting built on site was 16 weeks. Under traditional construction, you'd probably looked at about 40 weeks on site. So there was a huge reduction in that. And we'll talk about more in detail in a minute about how we achieved that.
Yeah, so this slide talks about the sort of the future green additions that we've been looking to add into the buildings. We'll circle back to the improvements that we made on the buildings as the program went on. But effectively, what we've been looking at doing is we've reconfigured the roofs so that they now fall towards the plant rooms, which has enabled us to then put rainwater harvesting tanks in on that side of the building. We've also made alterations to the hot water system. So that's now a closed system, which effectively makes the hot water a thermal energy store, which allows us to do things like use excess to be stored in the building to be used at peak energy points throughout the day. We've also put a lot of sensors into the building. So we've got window contacts. Now they feed back to the BMS and help determine the heating systems. And you can see here on this slide, particularly, we've been looking at battery storage solutions. You can see there with the red line, the initial peak is when people typically tend to take their showers in these blocks. And what you'll notice is that it's by far and away the biggest amount of energy that's used in these buildings. It's actually about 85%. Now, The green line is how much energy is produced from the PV panels on the roofs. And the area that is in red is how much of that energy is currently exported back to the grid and not used in the building. And the reason it can't be stored in the building is because there's no battery storage to utilize it. If you did have a battery storage attached to the building, you'd then be able to feed all of that energy back in and basically then use it to support those peak energy usages that you can see on the left-hand side of the graph. The area in green is how effective the PV panels are used on these buildings to basically make them off-grid as much as possible. So we've got a few. Paul, you can probably go through this one again. This is the evolution of the blocks, basically.
Yeah. So in terms of the evolution of the blocks, we started off with a single story. In fact, the one of the first picture on the right there was the very first prototype. And the very first prototype actually wasn't net zero. We calculated the building wasn't, it was actually using more energy than it used. But through calculations, we worked out if we put some more PV on the roof and to make some further alterations in the building, we can make it net zero. We went from the single story to a double story and looked to understand that. And we still were able then to come net zero. And then we've gone further evolution after that. We've gone to a brick skin solution. So the one on the brick skin is for the lived estate for the Army on the defence training estate. And that one is also CTN compliant, which is kind of, it's got blast resistance on it as well. And then the next evolution of the building is for the single living accommodation buildings, which is kind of like a next step up. It's where the soldiers stay when they're based on their barracks for years or 2 years. But all of this has been off a platform design. All of it has been kind of taken from the lessons learned from the very first NetCAP building we built 3 or 4 years ago. And all of these buildings are net zero in terms of low carbon use, in terms of low operational carbon, and very low embodied carbon. And the learnings have been taken on by on. We have not many people have built as many net zero buildings as we have. And it's with the air source heat pumps, as Tom mentioned, with all of the plant and the hot water and the generation. So we've taken so much learning from this, embedded into future programs. So it's been a real transformational program for the estate.
So one of the other clear benefits of modern methods of construction over traditional construction is how much less waste you produce. Now, we did a little bit of a study on the NetCAP scheme, and traditional construction produces around 1,400 kilos of CO2 for every £100,000 that you spent. We then compared that on one of our projects, on the NetCAP projects at NetCAP. And you can just see here that the difference is about a fifth of the construction waste used during the build. Now, some of the other wider benefits of MMC construction is because we're building all of these buildings in a factory and all of the buildings have a very similar design. If we over-ordered the amount of plasterboard we needed, we simply can just use it on the next project. So effectively, you've got a zero waste. You then multiply that through all of the different building elements that you get in the construction process, and you make incredible savings of how much waste, or rather lack of waste, you produce through MMC. Now, on top of that, we're also then building in sort of easy, like good conditions, factory conditions. It's dry, it's warm, it's easy to construct, which also increases productivity, and the quality is also better as well. So as Paul mentioned, getting that program down from sort of 12 weeks or 16 weeks down to 8 weeks in the factory, because we're spending less time on the building, we're also producing less waste, we're also using less CO2 because we haven't got plant running up and down either side, etc. Again, because we've also then built 70 of these buildings, when they come to site, we've managed to continually improve and complete more and more of these buildings in the factory. So when it comes to site, again, we've got less deliveries to the projects because everything's already in there. We're spending less time on site, so we're not hiring diesel generators or anything like that for extended periods of time on site, not to mention the quality benefits and general health and safety benefits that all of that reduced time has as well.
Before we move on, Tom, I think it's worth noting in terms of the productivity gains. I think we all know that construction's got a productivity issue. It hasn't improved at all over the last, I was going to say 100 years there, but that's a bit strong, probably the last 30, 40 years. But what's been interesting is that we've been able to reduce, because we track the amount of labour we spend on each of these jobs, and from the very first job to the last job where we are at the moment, we've reduced labour by 20% in terms of that number of man hours on the job. And again, we can't compare it against traditional, but we know traditional, that's is probably 50% less than traditional construction if we by building it in the factory and under kind of controlled environment. And I think this graph here just shows the journey we're on in terms of the EPC rating. And now I know EPC can be a bit clunky in terms of a measure, but when we did this at the time, it was the best one. So you can see for the very first prototype, we had an EPC rating of 12. When we looked at that, we worked out that actually if we add some additional PVs to the roof, we put some heat recovery units into the showers, we reduced the air tightness of the building, increase the air tightness of the building, then actually we can start getting EPC rating below 0. And for each kind of scheme we've gone on, we've reduced that more and more and more. So on paper, the buildings are net zero in operation, which is great, but on paper is one thing, but in practice is another. So if we go on to the next slide, Tom, we're now looking at the actual EUI. We're measuring where we are. So you can see the original EUI was 70, now we're down to 55, and we're getting real life data back showing us that actually we are hitting those numbers. And we identified areas where we can reduce it even further in terms of amount of energy we use in the building, which is then offset by the PV panels. We've also looked at how can we reduce that down to 35, which is the RRB 2030 standard. And again, we've kind of understood that it's actually the occupants of the building. So we're putting smart building technology into the building to recognise what's happening in the building in terms of the occupants and what's happening outside the building as well in terms of the weather and how that affects the energy use in the building, rather than just having the blanket seasonal commissioning. The building almost commissions itself every day in terms of the best use of energy or not energy coming on in the building. There's underfloor heating in the building, so air source heat pumps, which are then fed into by the PV panels on the roof. And we have a large water tank in the building as well. So we've really designed it to have the kind of the lowest energy requirement possible.
Yeah, so and taking that on to the next step, we've designed these buildings and they've evolved so much. So the next stage of how you reduce how much energy these buildings use is actually going to be through behavioural change of the occupants themselves. So what we've been able to do using the Thrive system is start feeding back information to the users. As we mentioned earlier, 85% of the energy in these buildings is from the hot water. So we've actually been putting QR codes into the bathrooms where the guys can go in and scan, and they can see just how much of their allocated hot water they've already been using. And quite rightly, the guys who are going first, if they're hogging all the hot water and the guys at the end have got none, then it kind of really sort of drives that behavioural change to start sort of making people use this building in a more energy efficient way. And that's what the Thrive system's been brilliant at being able to do on this scheme, and also helps inform our learning for future construction as well.
Yes. It's a good point, actually, Tom, in terms of letting the users of the building, the soldiers, understand that it's a net zero building. A lot of the piece is education, to let them know that actually there is a limit on hot water. They are allowed a 3 or 4 minute shower each. When it is hot outside, they should keep the windows shut rather than open them, because it's highly insulated building and keeps them out. So it's a real great learnings we've taken from this, and that we need to educate the user when they go into the building. And one way of doing that, as Tom mentioned, is using QR codes, using signage in the building to say this is how the building operates. And I think that the slide here just talks about the benefits of programmatic approach, just in terms of productivity, and also in terms of reduction of carbon. The more you build of a product, the more you understand it, and the more you understand it, you can then make tweaks in terms of understanding how you can reduce the energy, look for new materials, increase productivity in terms of build, and also put kind of different kind of M&E plant in the building. And also we're getting some really good data from the building as well, which we'll talk about now, but that's really kind of affecting how we can design in the future, that making sure that the actual design in the first place, we've not over-engineered the mechanical and electrical systems, and kind of understand what the requirements are. So one of the things that we put in the building, we put a smart building technology in there. So we've put a system that's a kind of open source, so all of the plant talks to each other. This enables us to get real life data from the building, so we know exactly how much hot water each shower's generating, what the feed is, what the drawdown is, how much PV is being produced in the building. For example, we can understand whether the south-facing elevation, whether the underfloor heating comes on later or during the day. If there's hot weather outside, then the heating won't come on. As we said, we're trying to develop a building system that actually recognises the external environments and whether the building's used or not. So the whole building doesn't come on if there's only one person in the building.
Yeah, and what's also really helpful for our clients at this point as well is we can then give them the information back so they understand how much energy and how much carbon these buildings are saving them annually. They can run it across the whole portfolio, all 70 buildings around the country. And that really, really helps inform them when they're trying to make business case decisions on where they want to invest their money next for future construction projects. It's really helping our clients be informed, which is something that they haven't had the luxury of being in the past. They haven't had contractors that can tell them exactly what their buildings are doing, where they should be looking at spending their money, and potentially challenging design codes or bits and pieces where they don't feel they are getting the best value for money and what they should be spending it on. So, for example, when we talked about the slide earlier of the battery storage solution, you can very, very easily see just how much energy is being lost there from not having the battery storage solution. You can then circulate that back, see what that would be across the whole estate, and then that helps them understand what they may or may not want to do in the future. So this slide is probably a little bit difficult to see, but it's basically all of the sensors within the building. And as you can see, there's about at least 4 or 5 in every single one of these bedrooms and quite a few in the plant room as well.
And I think this just wraps up what Tom was talking about, having the smart building technology in the building. If we're going to reduce carbon operationally, it's the users, and having a system that talks to each other and gives real life data feedback. And it starts learning the algorithms of how they're being used in the building. And we're going through that at the moment. And it's not a standard BMS, it's kind of moving on from that. And we're quite excited about this because I think this is where the transformation changes will come in building and operational. When there's new design codes coming out, new requirements and British standards in terms of how smart the building needs to be. But as we are really getting live data to feedback to the client. So, for example, if a client's looking at a fabric first approach as the arm we've been looking at, we can then feed them back. So that's fine if you want to go for air tightness of 1, but please note that your buildings, the soldiers have got the windows open 30% of the time. So it can be counteractive. Are you sure you want to go down that? Do you want air tightness of 3, or would you want to spend money elsewhere and put some more PV on the roof? So it's giving that real life data back to the client to make informed decisions on how they can reduce carbon. And actually, some of this learnings have been taken to other sectors, which we're working in the education sector and the justice sector. About when we design these buildings, we need to be careful about the embodied carbon consequences of not noticing the operational carbon consequences. And it's a trade-off at the moment, and that's where we are. But this program has given some amazing insight. We've developed the plant system. We're on our iteration version 5 of our plant system. So, 80% of the energy is hot water, underfloor heating, and showers. So we're making that plant system even more efficient. And I think this is where the future opportunity lies for reducing carbon.